So now let's talk about students who experience traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injury is a disability category, and these students, this is not something students were born with. It's not because they've gotten some disease or medical concern that's left them with damage to the brain. It actually has to be a traumatic brain injury, so a blunt force to the head. When we look at young people who are susceptible to TBI or traumatic brain injury, we see two lifespans that really impact them. And the first is toddlers, right? So those of us who are parents, we probably spent countless hours baby-proofing our home, putting the outlet covers in all the electrical outlets, and maybe creating some sort of soft edges for the sharp corners of our coffee tables and other furniture. Probably some of us got industrious and wrapped lots of surfaces in our home with pool noodles from the home improvement store. And we do this because as those young children are learning to walk or learning to move around, they fall. And they can, bump their head on a coffee table and do some real damage. So we have some students that have traumatic brain injuries because of accidents when they were toddlers. And then the next area of life or lifespan where people are susceptible to traumatic brain injury is really late adolescence. And so for a long time, it was way more boys than young women. And it was largely because of car wrecks, right? Because it doesn't seem to be a secret that teenagers who are given fast cars do silly things in those cars, and they get in bad car wrecks or football injuries. Today, we're actually seeing that young women are having traumatic brain injuries at higher rates, and you don't have to have a fast car to get into a wreck now. You have a cell phone, right? And so texting and driving has equalized that, unfortunately. When we think about students with traumatic brain injuries in the classroom, we're going to have a student who has probably been hospitalized for some period of time. A friend of mine, and I became friends with this person after she took classes that I was teaching for a local community college. When I finished my first master's degree in psychology, I started teaching in higher ed, teaching general psych and child development and abnormal psychology for a local community college. And I had this young woman that took all of my classes. She was a junior in high school, and she had a life plan that was very detailed and very ambitious. Her goal was to have an associate's degree when she graduated from high school and to go on to her undergrad, and by the time her peers were finishing their sophomore year of college, she wanted to be starting medical school. And this was her plan. She was very ambitious. She went to the Catholic private prep school in Atchison. She had a 4.0. She worked 3 jobs after school. She worked as a receptionist at her uncle's auto body shop, and several evenings a week she waitressed at a restaurant in town. And on the weekends she took care of her nephews for an aunt that worked on the weekends. When she was 16, she went to the car dealership in town, and she paid cash for a brand new car. So very ambitious, very intelligent young woman. In her junior year of high school, on Good Friday, it was the day after Thanksgiving, she was driving into town to pick up a friend, and they were going to go to a neighboring city to do Black Friday shopping. She had a single car accident. No one really knows why the accident occurred, but her car left the road. It flipped over 3 times before it came to rest in a field, and she was ejected through the closed sunroof of this car. And so a really horrific accident. Because she was driving a brand new car, she had the OnStar capabilities. So as soon as the car left the road, emergency vehicles were dispatched. And if that hadn't happened, she wouldn't have made it. Everyone says that if the ambulance hadn't arrived kind of right when it did, she would have not survived. And so she was in a coma for several weeks at a nearby hospital, and then as she came out of the coma, she was transferred to a world-famous rehabilitation center in Lincoln, Nebraska called the Madonna Center. And she was there for the rest of the school year. I happened to spend a lot of time talking to this young woman's mom through this, because they had always gone to the Catholic schools. They'd never had experience with public schools, and special education was a brand new thing for them. But it was really apparent that this young woman would need supports when she came back home. And so after many months away, she came back home in late April of that year, and the public schools where she lived provided what we call homebound services. A special ed teacher came to the home and basically tutored her several hours a week, because she didn't yet have the strength or the stamina to engage in school. And so as summer began, she stopped those services and she enrolled as a senior in her high school that next year. And it was apparent within 3 or 4 days to her that she still didn't have her abilities, that going to high school was not going to be possible. And so she becomes a high school dropout. She spent the rest of that semester studying and attempting to take the GRE, the GED. She receives that high school equivalent, and then as her peers are going off to college, she too continues her education at the community college. She had to go much slower in school than her peers. It took her 2 years beyond her peers to graduate from college. Instead of pre-med, she took a degree in communications. During the time she was going to college, she worked at a big box pharmacy. And by the time she graduated, she'd been promoted to an assistant manager. But shortly afterwards, she was fired. And when I talked to her about this, the reason that she was fired was she'd been working off the clock, meaning that she had came in early and stayed late to get her work complete, because the results of her traumatic brain injury meant that it was very difficult for her to form new memories. And so for her to do the kind of work that she was doing, it simply took her more time. It wasn't that she couldn't do it, she needed more time to do it. And so she was taking it upon herself to do that before and after work. But when you work for a corporation, and things like insurance are a part of the picture, working off the clock is frowned upon. And so she was warned once and then eventually fired. And so to me, this has always been a great reminder that when we have students with traumatic brain injuries, it's not that they can't, it's that they need a different way to do things. We also have to understand with these students that when we're interacting with parents, we're interacting with a group of parents that are unlike the other parents that we experience in special education, because they're brand new to all of this. Many students who have a disability and start receiving support in kindergarten or even before school, by the time those kids are in high school, their parents are experts in special education, and these parents aren't. These parents are brand new. Also, the student often remembers his or her abilities before the wreck. It's sort of like me. I like to ride a bicycle, and at some points in my life, I spent a lot of time riding and even competing riding a bicycle. And so every spring now when I get my bike out, the first few rides, I'm always really mad at myself, because I remember how fast I could ride when I was 20 or 22, and I cannot ride that fast now. And so sort of the same thing was true for Laura. She was so frustrated with herself because she could remember how easy schoolwork came to her before the wreck and how hard it was now. And she did need lots of extra time. And so this is the thing that we have to understand about these students if they're in our classrooms in our schools, is that the pace has to slow way down, that maybe a full school day is not appropriate for them. And even if it takes them longer, they still want to do it, but there's going to be a lot of frustration. Two things that we know is that schedules are really important. For Laura, it was remembering to take medicine when it was time to take medicine, to do other things, and she would constantly write out the schedule. Today, with an iPhone or an Android or a tablet, we can create visual schedules that come with alarms that help remind those folks what and when they need to do things, and so that's something that's very simple to do. The other thing we need to be mindful of is that we constantly need to reevaluate the students' abilities, because their abilities change more rapidly than other students with disabilities. And so constant reevaluation and a constant gauge of where they are, an assessment to know how they're doing and what things need to be altered. So those are really the big things to consider about folks with traumatic brain injuries. These students, this occurs infrequently within the population. These are students where, like some others we've talked about, it might be helpful to have a partnership with the public school to provide some of these supports. And we just need to know that the student and the family are walking through something traumatic and something new, and we need to be able to support them in that process.